let's talk about your work, sir. Um, Thank you, folks, for coming today. We have as our guest for this mid-December Patreon conversation, we have Aric Jorn, one of the members of this Patreon community, and for some time now, I've been aware of your artistic work, and I'm kind of fascinated by people who can make things. Right? I don't have the ability to make stuff with my hands. I guess actually maybe yesterday I sort of put the lie to that in one particular way, but for the most part, I don't have the power of making. So I'm kind of fascinated by it. So could you give us a little bit of a background about yourself, what you do, what materials you work with, what media you work with, and what you produce?
For sure. Yeah. First, let me start off by just saying that you've been a go-to resource of mine for about 6 years now, probably ever since I first read your translation of the Poetic Edda. I think was probably around 2017. And up until that point, I'd been working with the Hollander translation and the Bellows translation, and then yours came along, and it was just so clear, and I just really appreciated it. And
Thanks.
between your books and your YouTube channel, it's just the first place I go when I'm stumped and I'm looking for information about a piece that I'm working on. So many have been the time that I have thought how great it would be to sit down and have a chat with you. And so I was delighted to get the invite, and I'm not only interested to hear what you have to say, but anybody else who might be watching live, if they have any questions as well, that would be great. I'm going to start out by way of introduction with something I've never done, especially out loud to other people. So I look forward to you correcting my pronunciation. But you translated something for me a couple of years back, and I'm going to give it a swing. Ek heiti Aric Jorn, ok ek smida minder sagna. How far off base am I with that?
Actually, sound pretty good. Hold on. What was the context in which I
So
translated that? Did you just
so
like
I
I can't
came to you
remember the
with
specific.
the 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 way that I usually introduce myself in my studio is my name is Aric Jorn, and I sculpt myth. Unfortunately, there was no word for sculpt in Old Norse, and there was no direct word for myth. So I think you gave me the translation of I craft pictures or images of sagas,
Yeah,
and that's
I mean
how it kind of came across. So
that's that's what you said. Yeah. Um, and in modern Icelandic, yeah, mynd is a picture. Um, yeah, that is interesting because, so as much as you have to imagine that this society had lots of people working with their hands, and probably to some extent in very specialized ways. I mean, if you're good at working in stone, you might not be good at working in leather or something, right? They do tend to use like just this one word for making stuff, right? It's smida, and then the person who does it is smither. Um, yeah, just a curious little
yeah, yeah,
way.
yeah. So anyway, when I introduce myself professionally, I usually say that my name is Aric Jorn and I sculpt myth. And I get a quizzical look generally because people don't understand what that means. So I give them a slightly longer explanation, which comes down to I explore the stories of the Viking Age, be those stories from history or culture or mythology, and then I interpret what I'm reading through my art so that a modern audience can maybe understand it or have a visual reinforcement of that story. So I consider myself a narrative artist, which unlike decorative art or functional art like pottery, uh, all of my work starts with a story. So I'm reading the mythologies, I'm reading the history, I'm reading other accounts, be they fictional or non-fictional, and I'm internalizing those stories or those words, and then I'm outputting physical representation of them in the form of sculpture. And my goal is, I consider a successful sculpture one that if you don't have the words, the sculpture will still communicate the gist or the essence of the character or the story that's being represented. And that's always the final test to see if it's a successful piece. Um, so I guess I have a litmus test, which actually might help explain it a little bit further. I have three tests that any piece that I make has to pass. The first one, and it's kind of like my Hippocratic oath, I guess, is the way I think of it. First is perpetuate no known falsehood or misconception. So you're not going to see anywhere in my artwork, to pick a silly example, Viking with a horned helmet.
Hmm.
You know, if I'm looking at hairstyles, I'm not going to give somebody, a goddess, what was the thing from Friends, the Rachel, or whatever. I'm gonna be looking at historical things for that. So perpetuate no known falsehoods. The second one is when I have to use my imagination to fill in gaps, which is all the time. And I know you said it a lot on your own channel. The amount that we know definitively is so small that the artist has to fill in more gaps than there are facts in representing a character or a story. So when I have to do that, I try to make sure that I'm filling it with things that are historically or mythologically plausible. That is, things that somebody 1,000 years ago would have deemed an acceptable solution. So again, I'm not going to, you're not going to see the horned helmets. I'm not going to have furry loincloths with plate mail shoulder pads, any of the things that the fantasy artists are doing. Not that there's anything wrong with what fantasy artists do, but that's not where I'm geared to work in my own efforts. And then the third test, which is just kind of a fun mental exercise, I like to imagine that I have a time machine and that I can travel back 1,100 years. And were I to show this piece to somebody in Scandinavia, say around 900 or so, uh, would they recognize the story or the characters that I'm presenting? They probably won't recognize the style because I don't my job isn't one of replicating. I'm not looking at ancient artifacts and then copying that artifact in their exact style. I have my own aesthetic and my own style, but I'm trying at least to retain the story and the characters in a way that they would be recognizable. So um, those are sort of my processes. I sculpt in wood and wax clay primarily, and then I make molds of that, and I do limited edition castings then. That is usually done in a cold casting process, which is taking ground up metal and stone and wood fiber and mixing it in with resin. And it creates kind of a durable, long lasting, but lightweight kind of art form that I can treat just like the native or natural materials. So if I'm working with, say, bronze or nickel silver or something like that, there's enough metal content in there that I can buff it with steel wool to bring out, a reflective metallic kind of shine. I can add patinas to it for color. So it's a great material to work with, and it keeps uh, the negative aspects like price and things down so that more people can afford them, but it also still captures all the essence of those native materials. So that's the process in a nutshell. Um, and I was thinking, I don't know, I'm a complete noob when it comes to Zoom here, but um, I have maybe take a minute out and I could just show you some examples
Yeah.
of my work, just for those who might not be aware of it. Um, I'll go ahead and do that now.
And you are a co-host, so you can also share screen if you want, uh, or if you're or if you want to sort of take over the screen. I have it right now with you and me both pinned, but if you want to show something larger, I can unpin myself.
Okay, well, let me just put this up.
Okay, right now I see your Zoom window.
All right, perhaps I picked the wrong one. Here.
I see pictures now. Yeah.
How's this? Okay. Uh,
Where do you where do you make something that large?
I I jumped way ahead. I'll get there. I'll answer that question. Let
Okay.
me start at the beginning. So this is the first slide. This is what I call my mini myth collection. It has been a 6-year odyssey that, as luck would have it, ends this month. This month, I'm making the last contribution to this. But the series was I make one character every month from the Eddas primarily. There are a couple of characters that were inspired by the sagas or other places, but 95% of them are all from the Eddas, from primary sources. And the set you're looking at right now is about 4.5 years in. So there's about 20 other characters that weren't available yet when I took this photo. But they're chest-sized pieces. They're about 2 to 3 inches tall. And I I
I,
sold these as individual pieces at art shows and things like that. But I also had the idea to set it up as a subscription that I called the Myth of the Month Club. And the people who subscribed got to weigh in on what characters would be included and make any other requests that they might have. And one request that they unanimously had was they wanted a way to display them. And so I made a little shelf that I called Skithblathnir after Freyr's ship made by the Sons of Ivaldi. And unlike his magical folding ship, mine can't hold all of the Aesir, but you can get about 20 of them or so on there. Um, so this has been, like I said, a 6-year odyssey for me. It's been a lot of fun, and it's a staple in what I do. Jumping from one of these early collections to my latest thing, I have a new series that I'm calling Viking Artifacts. And here I am literally recreating, I'm creating idealized versions of artifacts as they would appear today. So rather than a shiny new sword that you could buy, say, at a Renaissance fair or other venues, I'm much more interested in how those artifacts look today in a museum kind of a setting. And we can talk more about either the minis or this series or anything else as we go, but I'll just get through the pictures really fast. This is another series I do called Mythic Pairs, where I take two different animals that were associated with one another from the Norse myths. So we have Odin's ravens, Hugin, of course, the wolves of Ragnarok, Skoll and Hati. We have the, I believe, unnamed cats of Freya or Freya,
yeah, I don't think
and
they're
then
named.
Thor's goats. So that's an ongoing series that I do. I
These
also do
these
a
are
lot of.
really cool. I mean, you know I'm a sucker for the Ravens, but the wolves are I mean that's really well done.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's funny because I talk a lot about how my work is designed to interpret the old stories for a modern age, and so a lot of people will look at a piece like the wolves, and when I tell them what it represents, this is one of the events of Ragnarok, basically the end of the world. Sometimes I'll get, well, why would I want to put that on my wall? And it's fascinating to me. I just listened to your great courses on Norse mythology, which I really enjoy, by the way. And I just happened to be on chapter 9 or lesson 9, and you made a connection for me that I was so happy that you said, because you said that there was no evidence of doomsday cults leading up, during the Viking Age, and so you would it was that people were much more focused on just getting through their lives and making the most of the time that they have. And I was so happy to hear you say that, because when I did the Wolves of Ragnarok, and this was, I think, 2016, when I did this piece, I used to tell people it's not a negative message. It's basically carpe diem.
Yeah.
It's a reminder of our mortality and that everything comes to an end, just like the Norse gods knew that they had an end point. And this is just telling you the end's out there. How are you going to use your time? So,
I think I think that's perfectly appropriate to, I mean, not that we have to get into the heads of another culture for what we're going to display or wear, but one thing that occurs to me in that connection is just how often you see serpents, snakes, dragons in Norse art. But of course, those are generally negative figures in myth. So just because something has a negative function in a narrative doesn't mean that people don't want to display it. And even if you think of one of those serpents being, Jormungandr or something in particular, well, then the notion could still be kind of carpe diem. Remember the serpent that's ready to end everything.
for sure. Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. So, um, yeah. Just I have a couple more just to give you some idea. This is a depiction of Hugin. His companion piece is scheduled for this year. I've been trying to work him in for the last year or two. I can't seem to find the time. A couple different views of him.
His feet are
And
great.
then I'm sorry?
His feet are great, and
Yeah.
and the and is the helmet based on Yermanbu or
I it conceptually the idea of having him sitting on a helmet just came from the names themselves. So Hugin is thought, right? So the idea of how do we, where do our thoughts originate? It's in our head, and how do you protect your thoughts? Then you wear a helmet, right? And Munin, if his translation is memory, he's going to be protecting his memories. And what do you do there? You write them down, right? So he's going to be sitting on or perched on a runestone is my idea for him. Um, as far as I was just looking at some of the early, it might actually be the crossover period between the Vendel style helmets and the early Viking style helmets where they had the ocular guards. So I don't know that I had any mythological imagery necessarily in mind with that piece, but yeah, I just wanted to represent an early Viking Age helmet, somewhat partially submerged, I guess.
by the way, you talk about putting Munin on a runestone. Uh, makes me think of the Rookstone, where there's that repeated phrase that Henrik Williams reads, Solgun ig mini, I tell Odin the memory. Uh, just strikes me as a very appropriate connection
Yeah.
for putting Munin on a runestone.
All right. See, you're helping me again. This is great.
Just a thought.
All right. So just a couple more. This is obviously a depiction, my take on the Oseberg Viking ship Crow. Um, I was fascinated by all the gripping beasts and really wanted to play around with that early Osberg gripping beast style of art. And I thought, what better piece to do than a representation of the prow itself? And then that leads me to where we started. This was actually, I just threw this in for fun, just before COVID, and I think it was February of 2020. I was commissioned by what was then Viking Cruises. Now I guess they're just Viking, and they did a big international media event in LA. and they made the entire event around my artwork, which was really kind of cool. So they actually hired a three-dimensional company, a 3D printing company, to take my sculptures and blow them up huge. So
Huh.
um, I didn't physically make these. These are digitally enhanced or increased versions of my sculptures. So we had the prows, and then we also don't look at my face, but if you look on the left side of the screen, you'll see my depiction of Thor fishing for Jormungand. And that piece is about 23 feet wide and 13 feet tall. And we had to have its own infrastructure built behind that white curtain to hold it up. But it was a super cool event. And it was so amazing to see my work up to that scale. It was kind of like walking through my workspace, but in miniature, you
Yeah,
know.
that's awesome. Yeah, like you've shrunk down into
All right.
a
So
mouse size little thing observing your own work. That's cool.
so I
I like your myth minis. Uh, so what was your favorite out of those?
it's usually whatever one I finished most recently, to be honest. There are a couple that really stand out for me. I just happen to have a couple of them in front of me, but I always like my Bragi,
Hmm.
uh, playing his Viking Age uh, lyre. But show you these two too. This is my depiction of a who me kind of a Loki kind of a character. And then when he becomes Thok later on in the stories, the facial resemblance,
Oh, cool.
I couldn't help myself. I had to make him basically the exact same face, just as
That's
the
cool.
old Jotun giantess. Um, but
I saw a couple birds that or are they Hugin and Munin, or do you have Veatherfulnir or
oh yeah, on the back of Odin, I have his ravens are perched on his shoulders. I have a runestone with uh, a raven on there. I guess I was thinking, I just read about the Valraven, which I think is from Danish folklore. It doesn't actually, I doubt it dates back all the way to the Viking Age, but that's what I was thinking of at the time.
the word sounds vaguely familiar without
I think it
being able
was
to think of it?
kind of a mystical, ill omen kind of a bird that would show up on a battlefield or where there had been a death. Um, I just remember it from a Danish folklore book that I had been reading, and I didn't know how far back it went. But I thought, a raven perched on a runestone, whether it's a ball raven or not, uh, works for me and my purpose. So, but
No,
the mini
like I
miss,
said,
it's
I
oh
really like the idea of putting Munin on one with that connection to the Rookstone. Now that because I'm pretty sure that's a like a last 3 years brand new interpretation of what that line of that stone means. But
yeah,
it's
I think that that would be perfect, and I'm definitely going to learn more about that because I wasn't aware when you said that this is a new translation. What was the
yeah,
original?
it's Henrik Velios. Well, there's so much confusion about so much of what the Rookstone says, right? But that's Henrik Williams's interpretation. I think he's probably mentioned it one way or another in every one of his appearances on this channel because we've almost always been talking about the Rookstone. But if you look at the video where he and I are actually at the stone, um,
Hmm?
he points it out and talks about it quite a bit. And of course, it's in his book, which I think is maybe the English translation is available now already. I know I helped him proofread it earlier this year, but it's called like the Rookstone and the End of the World. So I have the Swedish original probably within grasp.
Very good. Henrik Williams.
So, but of course, this is something that probably artists get sick of, right? Is you're sitting here showing me, wonderful things you've already made and talking about, future ideas. And of course, it's like, oh, I have something to say about this. Oh, I have an idea for you. You know, I'm sure you get pretty tired of that kind of thing.
Not at
Um,
all. You hear some pretty crazy ideas. I spend a lot of my time out in the public space. I'll be doing art shows or gallery events or artist talks, and so you never know who's going to be in the audience and kind of kind of off the wall ideas they're going to have for you. But no, they're always welcome. Love getting inspired.
and you're in Michigan, is that right?
I am, yeah, yeah.
And so are you going out to what are there like maker fairs or like Viking festivals, Renaissance festivals? Like where are
I
you?
haven't done any of those. I do fine art fairs.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I've been tempted on a lot of occasions to try to see what the reaction would be, say at a run fair or there's I think a big Irish fair in Dublin, Ohio that I've been looking at, but I haven't made it to one yet. I do fine art fairs, and I find I do really well in college towns. I get a lot of Norse or mythology majors who like to spend a lot of time in my booth talking about myth. So
That's fun.
yeah.
And so how long have you been working with Norse myth as your material inspiration? I mean, is this sort of like does it is its origin bound up with your origin as an artist or
So
were you working out of stuff before?
no, in fact, when I was growing up, I think like a lot of students, at least if you go back a number of years, the only mythology that I was really exposed to was Greek mythology in an official classroom setting. And it wasn't until many years later that I took it on myself to start reading and learning. And I think I was, to me, up until that point, Norse mythology could be summed up by, Marvel, comics. It
Yeah.
was Thor and Odin and all that. And I'm like, okay, you have a guy with a hammer and all that. It didn't seem like it could stand toe to toe with the richness and the depth of a Greek mythology. Um, and so I didn't really ever put the time into it, despite the fact that my family is Swedish and Danish. And um, but I was fourth generation, so none of that culture had trickled down to me. And so it wasn't until about maybe 15 years ago, I would say, that I developed a rather intense interest, and I decided to make up for lost time and really start exploring what the Norse culture and the Norse myths uh, had to offer. And I immediately fell madly in love with the whole thing. It's such a unique mythology in that it has its own kind of terminal point of Ragnarok, and yet still the promise of something that comes after. But it doesn't imply a cyclical nature. You don't get the impression that this is going to happen over and over and over again. Um, Although I suppose it could. I'm afraid I don't know, but um,
Yeah, that's become such a dominant interpretation lately, and I'm always been at pains to point out that the notion of a cycle really isn't in there. You can read it out if you want to, but there's nothing that says that it's a cycle.
yeah. So yeah, so I would say 2014 is when I officially started my studio and started to make Viking Viking Age sculptures. And in 2015, just a year later, I left what I was doing at the time. I was a historic presenter and pottery artist at the Henry Ford, which is the big museum, outdoor indoor museum in Dearborn, Michigan. And I left that position to do my studio full time. So I guess it's what is that, 8 years I've been doing it. So um, and getting back to the mini myths for just a hot minute. Uh, for me, it's an interesting story because it's like a Jungian uh, synchronicity effect that I experienced. One of the few in my life because I had been looking for a way to create art. This is around uh, 2016 or early 2017. I was looking for a way to create art that could help teachers who were introducing young students to Norse mythology. And I wasn't exactly sure how to go about that. It was just an idea that was kind of percolating in my head. But I knew that I had something unique to offer because from my own experience as a teacher, uh, you can give a reading assignment and say, go home and read this, and that's learning on one level. You can then discuss that reading. That's another layer. You can give them visual reinforcement, and that's yet another layer that's going to help them remember. But as a sculptor, I can offer a tactile element. I can give you something that you can actually touch or feel or connect with in a much more physical way. So I was kind of leaning into that idea, and at the same time, an art show challenged all the artists there to create work that was accessible to kids, to get them into having the experience of collecting art, which I thought was a fascinating idea. So that was another element. And then I had just, and this is again early 2017, I just picked up your translation of the Poetic Edda, and I was reading Voluspa, and at the end, after Ragnarok, where the survivors go out into the green new world that sprung up from the ocean, and they look through the tall grasses and they find the little golden game pieces.
Mm.
And it all just kind of came together. And I thought, I'm going to make that set. I'm going to make the golden game piece set from Voluspa. And I had always been in love with the Lewis Chessmen set, and that's what gave me the idea of personifying the pieces, turning them into physical representations of the gods and goddesses. So it all just kind of came together in a flash, and I knew that I was onto something that was going to be able to sort of meet all of those goals that I had.
That's, I mean, I certainly thought of the Lewis Chessmen when I saw your minis. Something about the style is, a little bit evocative of that.
Yeah,
And
and I wasn't sure if I was taking too much of given that litmus test that I always talk about, if I was taking a little too much liberty by representing the pieces in that way, by making them literally miniatures of the gods, because the Edda doesn't tell us, right? What did these pieces look like?
well, yeah, I mean, I guess, but at the same time, it's one of those things where taking some liberties all you can do. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was a year or so later that I read uh, Neil Gaiman's book on Norse mythology, and he described them as being in the likeness of the various gods. And I went, well, even if I'm making a mistake, at least I'm in good company. So
yeah, I mean, it's a fun image anyway, and of course, it also opens up, the sort of metaphor of the great cosmic game that's being played. Balder is a knight that's been sacrificed or something. But obviously, you've made many more than just a chess set now. Uh,
yeah, the full set is standing currently at 82 pieces, and I'm starting to feel like I want to branch out and maybe do some Viking adjacent things. Maybe do characters from maybe Beowulf, or get into some of the things that were akin to either on the east side, maybe Finnish mythology or Slavic, or off in the west, some Anglo-Saxon characters that maybe don't appear in the Norse myths directly.
You could have a ton of fun doing some zany Kalevala characters. Uh, I mean, that would definitely be a fun direction to go in.
Yeah, it's
and nobody knows the Kalevala. So.
well, that's part of the problem.
Oh yeah, sure. Even though
That's
J.R.
part of the
Tolkien
problem.
loved it.
Yeah, and it brings me to something that I'm super fascinated by personally, which is uh, the real challenge of an artist who wants to remain true to the authentic culture that they're trying to represent is given so little to work with, and so the vast majority of what I do is by definition from my imagination. And the closest I can get to it is to at least be true to the historical elements or historical finds that we've discovered. It's very difficult to get much further than that. And so it's amazing how much of a relationship, say, an author to a reader has that relies on the reader's imaginations, right? An author gives you a little bit of a description, and the reader is actually painting the picture
Hmm.
and filling in all the blanks. So you talk about since I know we both like a good Western, a cowboy walks into a saloon, dusty boots and silver spurs, making a jingling sound with every step, walks up to the bar, asks for a whiskey, whatever, looks around the room, doesn't see the guy he's looking for, right? But he knows he's going to show up. And this narrative can just build immediately this mental picture in the mind's eye of the reader. And yet when I look at that same passage as an artist wanting to create a visual image of it, I think you've given me nothing. I know the guy has boots and spurs, and that's about it. Everything else I have to fill in for myself, right? Is he
Yeah,
older,
that's
young, taller, short, older, thinner, fat, whatever.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you point that out. I mean, as I've gotten older, or as I've just read more over the years, I've started to really appreciate the the artistry of the author who does leave things just suggested, right? Because I think maybe when I was younger, and I'm not implying there's that my taste has become better or something, my taste has just changed, but I think maybe when I was younger, I enjoyed the kind of Tolkien way of like, and then over the ridge there was a lake, and around the lake there were 18 trees, and the trees were elms and ash. I enjoyed kind of trying to um, keep up with that. But I think now when I just hear, it was in a forest, like I have enough of a mental image of what that means. That's plenty. Like it gives me the setting
Sure.
that I need as a reader. But I can see what you mean by how, as a visual artist, that's sort of challenging because another reader, or if you're talking about current works, I mean, potentially even the author comes and says, "Oh, that's not what I pictured at all," um, which
And
is
you hear
kind of
that all the time with films, right? Film
yeah,
adaptations of novels, and how often is the author just absolutely thrilled with the result? Hardly never.
yeah. I mean, Stephen King legendarily hates The Shining movie, to the point that if you go to the Stanley Hotel in Estes, um, they only promote his like made for TV alternative form in the movie because he's so upset about the Jack Nicholson movie. But
Wow.
but I could see that actually being a little bit of a challenge for someone in your position, in the sense that you have your own very informed notion of what, say, Loki looks like, and you show someone this and they say, "Oh, this doesn't look like the guy in the movie," um,
Right, right, right.
because of course that's become such a dominant image. I mean, to the point where I've noticed that if you do image searches or whatever for Loki, there's this really dominant green palette now because there's that Marvel green palette for him, right? Um, those things really creep into the dominant understanding of these figures, and I can see that being something that you would have to kind of deal with, wondering like, well, how much do I try to play into what people are expecting to see here, and how much do I try to surprise them?
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually I'm glad you mentioned color because it's one of the decisions that I made. Um, all of my work is either based on metals or stones, textures and colors, and that's very much by design because that is all that we have from the Viking era in terms of artwork, right? Is they made their designs in stone or in wood or in metal, at least what has survived down to us. And so I'm reflecting that back rather than imposing a lot of color choices that may then open it up to be something that wasn't as authentic. I mean, we do have textile examples, so we know some of the color palette that they used, but I've chosen to kind of steer clear of that, so I don't have to spend my time debating whether Loki wore green or not, which isn't it's it's a fascinating question to me, but it's not a question that I want to have to defend or debate over every single time I put out a piece of art. And so I tend to just stick with those base materials.
Yeah, I think that makes good sense. Uh, Run by guess, by the way, have you felt tempted to put your own face on one of the gods?
Um, I am in there. I but it isn't something that has been released yet, so I'm not going to show it. But yeah, I did sneak myself in there, not as an actual god though, just as the as a maker, as an artist.
Okay.
But I am in there.
Are you the oh no now I'm trying to think. I mean that's a hint, right? I mean you could be the wall maker or or one of the sons of Evaldi or something like that. I think I think if I were doing this, I'd probably if I were gonna sneak myself in, I'd make myself like the severed head of Mimir. Uh,
Yeah,
just
he's actually in the collection. I have him. He's on a little pedestal, and Odin can consult with him whenever he likes.
it's, that's pretty fun. So are you working at home? Do you have a space at home where you do this, or do you have like a designated
Yeah,
workshop somewhere?
no, it no, I have a home studio. I do all of my work in basically 2.5 rooms, and I do most of the as much work as I can outside, honestly. Because of the materials I use, like the wax, I can't really do the sculpting work outside, but I do as much of the casting and finishing and all of that outside as I can. I like to be around trees and nature as much as I can as I'm spraying my chemicals.
Yeah. Well, hey, I mean, me too. I work more on the patio than anywhere else when I'm here or wherever. In fact, a lot of the Wanderers Hall Mall is written like in Rocky Mountain National Park. Um, just me sitting on a slope or something and working out there. I find that it helps get into an older culture's way of seeing things when you're not just surrounded by four walls and electronic plugs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean, my space is pretty crammed of everything from books to art to reference inspiration. You can't. There's not a square inch of blank wall, I don't think, in my space. But yeah, it helps to just get out and be someplace where I can hear birds and
and,
watch the squirrels run about.
and one other thing I know I wanted to ask you about, and of course, folks feel free to throw in other questions and remarks. is where did you learn to do this? I mean, is it uh, did you take classes? Were you taught by someone else? Did you figure it out on your own? Where did you
So,
learn?
without getting into the whole backstory, I guess I would just sum it up and just say, I went to art school. Uh, I went to college for creative studies here in Detroit, and got my bachelor in fine arts degree. And my concentrations were illustration and art history, and proceeded to take that where I thought I was going into the film industry, and I was going to do, posters and things like that for film, or maybe book covers, something like that. Um, and I kind of went into that career for a time. And it was right around the time that I switched over and started working at the Henry Ford in their pottery, and getting back into history and all that. Uh, I just ran away from corporate America. It just didn't sit well with my temperament. And I knew that eventually I wanted to return to where I think my heart always was, which was being a fine artist, being an individual artist, doing my own work. And I had never taken a sculpting class. So in and around between, I would say between 2010 and 2014, the same years that I was working as a history presenter and working in a pottery shop, and getting exposed to a lot of historical art, the old pottery from, say, the 1600s, 1700s, really started to pull all that together for me. And I taught myself how to sculpt. And I literally just bought myself materials and just started experimenting and playing around, and until something started clicking that I was happy with. And because that lined up exactly with my renewed interest in Norse mythology, that was my go-to theme, and it all kind of came together. A lot of trial and error, though.
Well, sure, but that has to be rewarding,
It is,
towards the
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot to be said about looking at something and saying, "Wow, a year ago I would not have known where to even begin." That process, and now here I have something that I might be able to, you know, take around to a show, and yeah.
And are the materials hard to come by? I mean, where do you
No,
get the
I use the wax clay that I use is a material called castelline, and it's been around, I think, actually since the probably the 60s or 70s. And it's a mixture of clay and wax. And it's a fascinating material because at room temperature it's hard, kind of like the consistency of a candle. But if you warm it up to around maybe 110 degrees, 120 degrees, it becomes really pliable like clay. So you can use tools to kind of move it around and shape it, and add textures and stuff to it. And then you just let it cool back down to room temperature, and it's hard again. And if you want to make changes, you can carve into it cold, or you can just warm it back up again and start moving it around like clay again. Um, and I do a lot of the engineering, like when I have something like the one of the prows, for instance. Um, this is all like constructed in wood first, and then I'm adding in all the little details with the wax clay. So
oh,
um,
okay,
it's kind of both a construction and a sculpting kind of a process.
that
And
makes sense.
the casting materials are, it's actually very popular. You see a lot of resin cast sculptures and stuff. I just take it an extra step. I don't just cast in the resin and then paint it. I'm actually infusing the resin with other materials like the metal or the ground stone. So I have a little bit more truth in material, I guess would be a good way to put it. Um, so I don't have to paint it to look like metal. It's actually metal in it, so I can buff it and it looks for all the world like it's made out of metal. Uh, but when you pick it up, you realize, well, it's far too late for that. So
And as far as something like one of the Myth minis, if someone orders, I want one Odin, please. Do you
yeah.
have do you do you just make it as it's ordered, or you keep these things? Do you make like several at a time and just kind of keep them around, or
So on the other side of my monitor, I have a wall of little tiny drawers, and each drawer has got a little picture of the mini. So I try to keep inventory up, and it's just a matter of pulling them out of the drawers. But this time of year, I very often lose the race of trying to keep up with the demand, and so I often am. I have a lot of work ahead of me. I'll put it that way. January is going to be busy to repopulate those drawers, but um,
so you're making one of like what one several of one figure at a time? Is that typically how
well,
you do
yeah,
it?
because when I do the original sculpt, then I make a mold of it, and I can make multiple castings out of that mold. So I'll usually do a batch of maybe 10 or 20 of them at a time, and kind of move on from there.
And when you're actually doing the sculpting, um, how much time are you taking on a figure? Are you and this is something I wonder about from my own very minor dabblings into art, is how do you decide this is done? I don't need to add something to this any further, right? Like, going
Okay.
further is gilding the lily or something like. Are you disciplined with that?
I I would be remiss if I didn't point out that somewhere out there, my wife is absolutely falling out of her chair laughing right now at that question because I am constantly accused of continuing to work on something where I'm really just working for myself at that
Mhm.
point, and that nobody else is ever going to pick up on the details that I'm obsessing over. And uh, yeah, so it's tough to know when a piece is finished, when it's going to serve its purpose, and I'm better served by just moving on to the next piece, so that's a constant struggle, and I think probably every artist uh contends with that, and I wish I had the magical recipe, uh some little bell that would go off when it was done, but I don't.
Yeah, because I mean, even I could, this is way too simple a level, but it's amazing that even at the simplest level of playing, a Jackbox game or something like Tikio, where you have 60 seconds to draw a T-shirt, there's a point where maybe after 40 seconds you you've communicated your intent. Like adding stuff is actually subtracting from the finished product. I was
Yeah,
thinking about this yesterday because I was actually, I know this is a little bit of field, but these are the closest ways I can come to sympathizing with making art. I was in a needle felting class and I made a hummingbird. And there was a point, well before the class was over, where I thought, God, this is done. Like I feel like I'm supposed to take this extra time, but it's like it seems like gilding the lily at this point. Like I don't know. Like do I try to add individual feathers or something like that? There's a point at which detail is a losing battle, right? Because
yeah,
you it, detail draws attention to itself in a way. You know what I mean?
yeah,
That seems to me to be the case, and it's also part of why I'm asking you is it seems to me that you have a really good eye for the right amount of detail. I mean, if you look at something like, I was really admiring your Hugin on the helmet, and I thought, it's just that perfect amount of detail where you perfectly suggested the shape of the bird, the crafting of the helmet. You have a couple little details, and then you even have little flourishes like your shoulder, that's circle you do in the shoulder, which I've seen you do in a few
yeah.
other products
Yeah.
too. And it really seems perfectly balanced to me. And I just think, gosh, how do you know like this is done? You know?
But I think some of it is probably just my training in two-dimensional art. Yeah, the graphic training, the illustration training, um, gives you an idea for or an eye for composition, which is something you always have to have in your mind. The other thing I think is a matter of scale, like how big are you working? You know, the bigger the piece, the more detail opportunities there are. But that doesn't mean that you should necessarily take all those opportunities, right? Just because you have a big canvas doesn't mean that you have to put in as much detail as you would on a small canvas. And I think it is just maybe finding that balance. And I look at each series, each piece as sort of its own puzzle in that regard. You know, how much detail does this require? And I find actually that I with the mini myths, for instance, I spend more time on those on little details because there's so little space that if I don't kind of go in with the real fine tools, it's just going to look like a roughly hewn kind of chess piece. You know, and I want to get into the face. You know, just to pull another one out. You know, when I was doing an off-show focus, um, but this is Sigan, and I really wanted to catch kind of the the kind of sorrow and yet determination and things like that in her face. And I couldn't do that without achieving a certain level of detail.
Mhm.
So I think that the purpose of the art also probably informs how much detail you need to be able to capture the character or capture the story. Um, and
I admire that as as actually one of the great talents of a good artist is that sense of proportionality that way. Um, I feel like it's really one of the marks of, you know, and not that being an amateur is a bad thing, but but one of the marks of an amateur is probably an inclination to over detail. Um, because of
yeah,
course, I think one of the things that makes a work of art, like something that you make more more special and more your own, is what you're choosing to have there and what you're choosing not to have there. It's not just a photograph of something.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I find that I, I know it's probably a strange way to put it, but like I just find it fascinating, just that mental discipline. So congratulations, you have a mental discipline that I don't know. I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, and I'm right with you in that there's absolutely no shame in being an amateur, just like I consider myself to be an amateur historian. You know, it's a it's an intense interest I have.
Mm.
And I do as much reading about it as I can, and I study it and I try to interpret it as best as I can through my specialty. But I'm not going to be giving, you know, historical lectures anytime soon. You know, it's just an interest that I have and something that I'm very passionate about.
Makes sense
Um,
to me.
you know,
And
it's oh, go
no,
ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, since we're talking about detail and when to stop and levels of realism and those things, um, I thought it might be even a good time to talk about the latest series that I was working on, which is the Artifact series, um, because I kind of went all in with the history on those because I had to. I wanted to explore those artifacts as they would appear today. Um, and that really posed a whole new level of challenge for me. And yeah, I mean, uh, I threw a picture up before I do actually have the piece, and I at least wanted to show this one to you. Both be think I because I think on your recent conversation with uh, Jonas Markussen, uh, I actually that was several years ago. I think maybe 3 years ago or so
Yeah.
when you talked with him,
Yeah, Jonas Markussen.
and you guys were spent a hot minute talking about the Mammon axe, and it put me in mind of the piece I was working on. And you actually helped me name this on your last office hours. I named this Hairblather. So this is a Battle Glad, and this is my attempt at creating what I kind of perceive as uh, the ideal Viking sword. Um, and what I mean by that is if I were to go back in time and I were a Viking and I was fortunate enough to be able to commission a sword, this is what I would have commissioned. Uh, and that it took me doing a lot of research to find out if my ideal sword could actually exist. And so I was always in love with the three-lobed pommel, for instance, with the dominant central pommel. And I liked the wider, slightly flared cross guards.
Mm.
And in my research, I discovered that there was a window from about, I think, 925 to the year 1000 when this exact style of hilt existed. It was called the Peterson, I think, classified it as the Type S hilt. And then I found the blade that I thought would best go with it, which is the Type 3 blade with a very gradual taper and a long, wide fuller. And that existed much earlier up until about 975. And then I wanted to select the pattern, the knotwork, the silver inlay that I wanted to include on it. And I've always loved the bore style
Mm.
because it's a very compact style, very little negative space in between the knots. And I thought just graphically it would fill the space of the hilt really well. And that was a style that was from about 850 to 950. And so I found there was this sweet spot when this hilt, this blade, and this artistic style all coexisted. And that was between 925 and 950 AD. And so getting back to that plausibility, this is a plausibly constructed sword, even though it's my own design and my own choices. But it
That's
could have
cool.
existed, and so
Yeah, and plausibly dateable. I mean, that's
plausibly
pretty
dated.
cool.
Yeah,
I like the style. And how much does it doesn't look like it's heavy
it's
when you
not. No, so I make these and I mount them on a solid red oak board that I stain and but the sword itself only weighs about 3 pounds, 3 or 4 pounds. Um, when you put it on the board, it's more like 10 or 11. But
that's pretty cool. And you also have a spearhead in this series.
yeah, got so this one maybe you can help me with the pronunciation on this, but I'm calling it Ulfston for wolf's tooth. How would you pronounce that?
Wolfstone.
Ulfston. Okay. Uh, and this is I named it Ulfston for two reasons. Uh, First, spear was a symbol of Odin, and so I knew I wanted to do the silver socket.
Nice.
It has the inlay, and I did a depiction of Odin's head, and then underneath he's flanked by his two ravens. And I was trying to figure out a way in the design that I could also incorporate his wolves. And there just wasn't enough real estate on the socket. And so I decided to name the entire thing sort of in honor of them.
Hmm.
But there's another reason too. and that's because in my research on weapon making, which has been a journey unto itself, I discovered that a lot of these spears from this period were actually constructions using two different kinds of metals. So they would use the hardened steel as an edge steel, and then a hard iron core, where it didn't matter if the material could hold an edge; it was just there for strength. And the way that they would construct the spears is to take a bar of the steel and cut notches, V notches all along it, and then do a matching set of V notches along the iron core, and then fold that edge steel over it, like connecting it like a zipper. And then they
Hmm.
would hammer weld the two materials together. And when it was a new functioning spear, it wouldn't be apparent always. But as the materials deteriorated, because they would deteriorate in different ways and at different rates, the iron would start to deteriorate faster than the steel, and it
I
would
see.
reveal that zigzag pattern, which is called the wolf tooth pattern. So I thought that was a
Cool.
perfect namesake or moniker
Cool. I know
for the
Stella
spear.
points out if Anatoly Lieberman's right, Vidar's name is also related to spears. So the wolf's tooth thing is kind of cool considering the jaw breaking incident.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you, Stella.
So all kinds of confluence here. That's really, really cool. And do you have more items in the artifact series planned then?
Yeah, I'm hoping to do three more in the series for 2024. They'll probably be smaller. I want to do an axe head. I'd like to do perhaps like a CX, uh, uh, and possibly like a fragment of something else, because I don't want them all to be weapons. So I was thinking maybe a nasal guard and a partial helmet or something like that. Yeah, because this was an idea that I had. I grew up with both my parents were artists, and they would take me to a lot of museums. And we're lucky to have the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Arts, basically in our backyard. And I'd spent a lot of time in their great hall where they have all the arms and armor displays. And I always used to dream of having a house that was decorated that same way,
Hmm.
and I came to realize as an adult, that those things belong in museums so that they can be properly, preserved, and so that they can be available for everyone to see, not just in a private collection. But still, I had the dream. I wanted to have those artifacts up on the wall. And so last year, I kind of revisited it, and I said, you know what, I can do that. I'll just make them myself. And so that's my vision. I want to have a whole wall of these things eventually. So
Very cool. Well, I look forward to that. I mean, one non-weapon idea that occurs to me, again, here I am being the guy of here's an idea,
no,
is
please.
um, there's this big rings, um, like this one from I want to say Forsa in Sweden. Um, Sometimes they have runic inscriptions on them. Um, I mean, there would be another metal artifact that would be definitely outside of the weapon family.
I'm not sure what you're referring to exactly, but it reminds me of a story that I came across. I do these virtual events. We do like the virtual walk, run, bike events as sort of fundraisers for the studio. And this year we did Iceland, and so we were walking along the southern coast of Iceland and up the west coast. And I share little stories along the way. And one of the stories I encountered was about supposedly the two of the first inhabitants or settlers in Iceland. One had gotten there first and claimed a chunk of land, and then the second one came and claimed the adjoining piece of land. And there was a flood, I think, was the story that came down from an iceberg or a glacier, and it was just going on the new guy's land. Now, thankfully, he was a wizard, or a sorcerer, so he used his magic to push the flow of the water onto the other guy's land. Turns out the other guy was also a wizard, and so there was this ebb and flow of this water between these two warring landowners, and that accounts for the curve of the water coming down. And anyway, the story goes on, and they finally agree on where the divide was going to be in their property or something like that, and that accounts for this waterfall. And there was a chest hidden in there, and it had a big ring that was covered in runes. And anyway, it ended up on the door of a church. Is cutting to the chase. And I guess there's a famous church in Iceland that has this ring that is supposedly connected to this story. And I wasn't
That
sure
is
if that.
that is the kind of thing I'm thinking about, because
Okay.
there's at least one pretty famous example of this from Sweden. I want to say it's from Forsa FORSA. Um, but yeah, I'll see if I can track down. I know I have a picture of this because I would show it in some classes. That might be a fun artifact for you. Anyway,
Yeah,
just
I'd love to see it.
just thinking out loud. Um,
Yeah.
being the backseat artist here. But I really like your stuff. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about it. And I'll look forward to more, especially more in the artifact series. And I'm looking forward to seeing next stuff in the myth minis, because it sounds like we have some more fun things coming that way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And of
Well, thank you so much for this time.
course, and I'll be in, Ohio, which isn't like next door to you exactly, but maybe possibly I can make some kind of swing up your way where it'd be worth your while to say hi for a minute. We'll see. I'll let you know.
Yeah, I'd love it. I'd love to.
All right. Well, thank you very much, sir, for your time. Thank you, Patreon, for coming. Thank you, Stella, for the links in the chat. And well, for now, I'll wish you all the best and happy holidays.
Same to you.
All right. Bye for now.